Today's topic is ethnobotany and intercultural healthcare. I took this photo while doing field work in Ecuador. We were learning about traditional medicine in Ecuador in order to improve the healthcare provided to the Latinx communities in Madison, Wisconsin. Lucila, the person photographed here, is holding flowers that she uses to prepare postpartum healing baths. She expressed to us the difficulty of obtaining these flowers in the United States and how it has impacted the postpartum health of women she knows who have migrated to the United States. We'll talk today about how traditional medicine practices change or don't change upon migration. Today's lecture will begin with the family of the week. Then we'll look at some overarching concepts related to traditional medicine, followed by how traditional medicine is impacted by migration. We'll then explore the concept of intercultural healthcare, followed by a look at how ethnobotany relates to all of this. Our family of the week is the Amaryllidaceae, or onion family. This family includes a number of ornamental and horticultural flowers, including daffodils, snowdrops, and amaryllis. It also includes some important, what I'll call food as medicine plants, like onions, leeks, garlic, ramps, and onion grass. The first three listed, onion, leeks, and garlic, were domesticated in Eurasia, and the last two, ramps and onion grass, are wild North American edibles. Onion grass can be found in crumb woods in the spring. It looks like this on the bottom right. And I find that it's often growing in tufts that stick up around the grass or other ground cover around it. When you break off the leaves, they smell just like onions. The Amaryllidaceae, along with the Poaceae, were our only two monocot families of the week. Monocots share a number of characteristics, including having only one cotyledon, or first leaf, parallel leaf venation, and flower parts appearing in threes or sixes. You can see some of these characteristics in the photos on the right. Onion family plants also generally have juicy leaves, think of the thick leaves on an onion plant. They often store carbohydrates in underground bulbs. And remember, bulbs are modified leaves and stems, like an onion or a head of garlic. And their flowers are lily-like, as you see in the daffodils, or are clustered in umbels, as you see with this ornamental allium on the bottom left. Even when in umbels, you can see the tiny flower parts in threes or sixes. Members of the allium genus, which includes all of the food medicine plants I have listed, are characterized by their thiosulfonates, which are sulfuric compounds produced when their cells are broken, similar to the way in which glucosinolate compounds are released by Brassicaceae plants. And like glucosinolates, thiosulfonates have the ecological roles of killing microbes and deterring pests. Different thiosulfonate compounds are what give these plants their oniony flavor, make raw garlic spicy, and cause our eyes to water when cutting onions. At least in part due to these compounds, allium vegetables are important to traditional medicine around the world, playing many roles, including to strengthen the immune system, lower blood pressure, and kill parasites. They are particularly relevant to this week's topic for a couple of reasons. First, due to the near ubiquity of vegetables like onions and garlic, they are especially relevant to the traditional medicine of immigrant communities. And second, because they straddle the line of food and medicine, patients may not mention them if their healthcare providers ask about herbal medicine, and this, as we'll see, can have important consequences. Let's start out with a look at what is traditional medicine. In your reading, Vandebroek uses the World Health Organization's definition for traditional medicine, which is knowledge, skills, and practices based on the theories, beliefs, and experiences indigenous to different cultures, whether explicable or not, used in the maintenance of health, as well as in the prevention, diagnosis, improvement, or treatment of physical or mental illness. I added the text in brackets to clarify what I think the World Health Organization meant by explicable, and that is explicable by Western science. Vandebroek goes on to describe traditional medicine as being embedded in culture-specific understandings of the body, wellness, and illness, as well as relying largely on herbal medicine. Most people practice some form of traditional medicine, which we'll talk about in a moment, but the emphasis of intercultural healthcare specifically relates to the practice of traditional medicine by what Vandebroek refers to as local communities, defined as indigenous, minority, and/or underserved communities. This emphasis is due to these communities' long history of using traditional medicine, as well as the potential for intercultural healthcare to improve public health in these communities. Traditional medicine is often contrasted with biomedicine, also referred to sometimes as Western medicine, and I've made some changes to the definition of traditional medicine to write this definition, which is the knowledge, skills, and practices based on, or purported to be based on, Western science, used in the maintenance of health, as well as in the prevention, diagnosis, improvement, or treatment of physical or mental illness. As I'm sure you've all realized is a theme to this course, and to life in general, these terms are presented in contrast, but medicinal knowledge, skills, and practices are unlikely to fit entirely within one term or the other, but rather we can use these terms to understand different aspects of various forms of medicine. In a study by Vandebroek and Balick, they explore foods used as medicines by the Dominican community in New York City. One example is coconut. Looking specifically at the diseases this is used to treat, some of these are defined by Western science, such as kidney stones, asthma, and bronchitis. And individuals may be diagnosed with these conditions by biomedicine providers and influenced by mainstream media about Western science research touting the health benefits of coconut. Other diseases coconut is used to treat are not understood by bioscience, such as empacho, which is what Vandebroek and Balick describe as a folk illness that manifests as a gastrointestinal disorder that is believed to be caused by obstruction of food or something else in the stomach or intestines. To treat empacho, they found that Dominicans use the roots of coconut plants as one of the ingredients in an herbal mixture called botella. The knowledge of how to make botella, as well as other medicinal preparations of coconut, such as coconut shell tea, are cultural and shared among community members. And just as medicinal knowledge, skills, and practices are unlikely to be entirely defined by either traditional medicine or biomedicine, neither are people or communities. In fact, most people rely on some combination of traditional medicine and biomedicine to support their health and treat disease. Because traditional medicine is rooted in culture and community knowledge, it is often also place-based. So what happens to a person or community's traditional medicine upon migration? Your reading by Muniz de Medeiros and colleagues reviewed the literature about the use of medicinal plants by populations who have migrated long distances or internationally, and their work, and that by others, provides yet further support that traditional knowledge and practice is not static, but rather dynamic and adaptive. This is demonstrated by what herbal medicines migrant populations use, from where they obtain their medicines, and how knowledge changes or doesn't change upon migration. In terms of what herbs migrant populations use, I love that these researchers summarize their findings in a similar way as Nguyen in the paper I presented earlier about substitution, insertion, and deletion in food systems. However, they use slightly different language. In their review, they discussed the possibility of replacing herbal medicine ingredients with new ones, which is similar to Nguyen's idea of substitution and may occur when an exact herb is not accessible in a new location, but other similar herbs are. They also describe the possibility of incorporating entirely new herbs that play new roles, similar to Nguyen's idea of insertion. They say that one cause of incorporation is when a population encounters a new disease for which they do not have a traditional treatment. And they use the term abandonment in a similar way that Nguyen uses deletion. This may be driven by a disease no longer existing in the new environment, or when an herb cannot be obtained or replaced. Muniz de Medeiros and colleagues also explored changes in where immigrant populations obtain their herbs, and this is often dependent on the plant's ecology and distribution, as well as the cultural composition of their new location. Van de Boek and Balick, in the paper I mentioned earlier when discussing coconut, looked at differences in where medicinal foods are obtained by Dominicans in New York City versus Dominicans in the Dominican Republic. In this figure, the white bars represent Dominicans in the Dominican Republic, and the black bars represent Dominicans in New York City. And you can see dramatic differences in where each group obtains their medicinal foods, with Dominicans in New York City much more frequently citing botanicas and bodegas, botanicas being shops specializing in herbal remedies and spiritual items, and bodegas being small Latino and Caribbean neighborhood stores. And Dominicans in the Dominican Republic showing greater relative frequency of obtaining medicinal foods from the market, patio garden or farm, and harvesting wild. I think this figure is an excellent display of the adaptability people demonstrate in order to meet their needs given the resources available. Muniz de Medeiros and colleagues also touch on how knowledge about traditional medicine changes upon migration, and there are numerous case studies that refute the common assumption that migration equals assimilation equals loss of traditional medicinal knowledge. One case study, again, one published by Van de Broek and Balick about Dominican immigrants to New York City, does just that. In their figure 1, bar height corresponds to the number of medicinal plants reported for 30 common health conditions. Data are presented as the square root transformation of the mean number of medicinal plants reported among interviewees. So just know that the height corresponds to the number of medicinal plants, but the numbers on the y-axis are not the actual number of medicinal plants reported. And you can see that plants were labeled as either food medicines, like garlic or coconut, the black bars, or non-food medicines, like aloe or chamomile, the white bars. The pair of bars on the left indicates medicinal plant use by Dominicans in New York City, and the pair of bars on the right indicates medicinal plant use by Dominicans in the Dominican Republic. And you can see that Dominicans in New York City reported using more food medicines than those in the Dominican Republic, and they reported using more food medicines than non-food medicines. Van de Broek and Balick's findings are exciting because they refute this common assumption that traditional medicinal knowledge declines with migration, and also because they provide evidence for Dominicans in New York City actually increasing the diversity of medicinal foods they use. Vandebroek and Balick did not investigate the mechanisms behind this unexpected increase, but it could be related to knowledge sharing among different cultural groups in the highly urbanized transnational setting of New York City. Given the importance of traditional medicine and its vibrancy among different cultural groups in urban areas, Vandebroek describes the potential role of intercultural healthcare in improving public health of local communities, which are often impacted by racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. As a reminder, Vandebroek uses the term local communities to refer to indigenous, minority, and/or underserved communities. She defines intercultural healthcare as the integration of traditional medicine and biomedicine as complementary healthcare systems. For example, if a patient has diabetes, her biomedical healthcare provider might begin by asking what she is already taking for diabetes. She might respond that she eats a certain amount of nopal cactus pads daily, and her provider would ideally understand how this might impact her blood sugar and provide guidance that takes this into account. Sounds like a good idea that makes sense, right? But there are many challenges to its implementation, often stemming from a lack of cross-cultural understanding, respect, and trust on the level of individuals, communities, and social hierarchies of value attributed to different knowledge systems. These challenges relate to communication, both in terms of patients not disclosing their traditional medicine with physicians and physicians not asking or engaging in discussion about traditional medicine. They also relate to physicians' lack of knowledge about traditional medicine and herbal remedies, as well as difficulty in accessing this information, which we'll touch on in a moment. And last but not least, these challenges also relate to a clash between knowledge systems, resulting in mistrust in both directions. But the practice of intercultural healthcare has the potential to improve biomedical healthcare provided to patients practicing traditional medicine. Vandebroek specifically mentions that it can contribute to safe herb use, both because physicians will be aware of potential herb-drug interactions, as well as possible adverse effects of herbal remedies. She also suggests that increased trust and cross-cultural understanding can improve patient compliance for treatments prescribed by the physician. And this is all complemented or magnified by the idea that feeling cared for and empowered are integral to positive healthcare outcomes, even when the treatment lacks a physiological basis. Now I'd like to look closely at an example, a program that is intercultural, interdisciplinary, and has direct impacts on public health. And this is the example that Vandebroek touched on toward the end of her article, Cultural Competency Training of Healthcare Providers in New York City. This program is a collaboration among the New York Botanical Garden Institute of Economic Botany, medical schools, hospitals, and community clinics, and the Caribbean and Latinx communities in New York City. The program seeks to build the cultural competency of healthcare providers and medical students in order to promote cross-cultural respect, trust, and increased disclosure between physicians and patients from diverse cultures, and in so doing, improve healthcare delivery to underserved populations. Their program has 5 components: lectures, interview and role play exercises, ethnomedical Spanish classes, guided visits to botanicas that sell medicinal plants, and tours of the Botanical Gardens Caribbean medicinal plant collection. The photos here display some of these components. The photo on the bottom left is of the Caribbean plant collection at New York Botanical Gardens. Just think what an extraordinary resource this is for medical providers to see the living plants they are learning about and which are so important to their patients. The three other photos give a better idea of what these botanicas may be like. On the left, you see someone holding both dried and fresh medicinal herbs. Remember that many herbs that immigrants may have harvested themselves or purchased fresh in their home country can only be obtained dried and packaged wherever they now live. The photo on the far right shows what it looks like when a botanica receives shipments of dried, unpackaged herbs. And I think this picture does a great job of showing how difficult it can be in urban ethnobotanical research to correctly identify the plants you are studying. And I included the photo on the top as well to show other forms of traditional medicine available in botanicas and which students in these trainings learn about. Since 2008, over 740 people have participated in this training. I'm sorry to say that I haven't seen any rigorous assessments of their impact on public health, so unfortunately, I can't report on that. I want to end by touching on the importance of ethnobotany in all of this, both in terms of ethnobotany education for healthcare providers and in terms of the potential contribution of ethnobotanists themselves. Ethnobotany can play an important role in successful intercultural healthcare. Vandenbroek described a few key ways in which ethnobotany research can be particularly impactful in this area. And that is when such research is ethically sound, locally situated, and has direct practical impacts. I will add that I believe ethnobotanists and those with education in ethnobotany are especially skilled at recognizing and valuing different ways of knowing, as well as communicating across knowledge systems. These attitudes and skills are essential to bridge the divide between traditional medicine and biomedicine. I'm hoping that after this course, you will continue to apply these attitudes and skills to your work and your life. And I believe that the Pironi et al. Paper about traditional medicinal approaches to the COVID-19 pandemic exemplifies these points. Their work is simultaneously global and local, with an international team of researchers looking at community-level food medicine responses to COVID-19 in 17 locations around the world. I appreciate that they recognize the value of these health behaviors, both in the context of Western biomedicine, due to the bioactivity of phytochemicals, as well as more holistic indicators of well-being, such as social cohesion, agency, and resilience. And one other area I would like to highlight in this section, since it was only touched on briefly in the reading, is the importance of correctly identifying plants used in herbal remedies when conducting research on them, which is something that a background in ethnobotany or botany can prepare you for. We've discussed before about the importance of using correct Latin binomials when writing about plants to avoid ambiguity and communicate clearly. But this takes on a new level when others are using your research in a clinical setting. Proper botanical identification in this context is important for safety. You can imagine the dangers of mistaking one medicinal plant for another. Proper botanical identification and writing names correctly also allows your research to be accessible to anyone searching for it. A recent review of 100 publications on medicinal plants found 20 taxonomical errors just in the titles and abstracts. For example, Latin names were misspelled or outdated Latin names were used instead of revised names. This means that if you want to search for information on a particular plant, These publications will not come up in your search, and the public cannot benefit from the findings. And third, since Latin names tell us something about evolutionary relationships, and because evolutionary relationships can tell us something about secondary metabolites, we can make hypotheses about plants' medicinal activity through their Latin names. So let's take a closer look at how this is done. This is a figure from a paper called Phytomedicine 101, Plant Taxonomy for Preclinical and Clinical Medicinal Plant Researchers. I love that this paper is from an oncology journal and written by 2 botanists. It shows the steps for properly identifying and documenting plants in medical research. The first step is to collect a voucher specimen. You've now maybe seen the term voucher specimen come up a few times in your readings. A voucher is a botanical specimen of the exact plant you are doing your research on, so that it can be physically and permanently documented. Its identification can be verified, and the research you do can be reviewed or reassessed in the future. Ideally, you would press and dry the plant with its reproductive structures for easier identification, and you prepare it to eventually be deposited in an herbarium, which I'll touch on in a moment. But for now, know that this preparation means mounting it on archival paper and including key information about who collected it and when, as you can see with this example on the left. Then, you must properly identify the plant using taxonomic keys, which we discussed in week 3, or consulting with a specialist. Once it is properly identified, this information must be added to the voucher specimen, as you know, written and spelled accurately. Then, this voucher specimen is deposited in an herbarium. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, an herbarium is a collection of dried, labeled plants that are arranged systematically. They are like a huge works cited list for botanical research, or you might think of them as a library of dried plants. And not only are they important for documenting and verifying research that has already been conducted, but they are invaluable resources for ongoing research. For example, the image on the right is of the herbarium of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew in London, and it has herbarium specimens from Darwin's voyages. Researchers can use historical collections such as these to investigate changes in plant distribution, morphology, and even genetic composition, since you can often analyze DNA from small samples of the dried leaves. From herbaria to medical clinics, botanicas to research laboratories, I hope that this lecture has helped you to appreciate the importance of ethnobotany to culturally sensitive public health care.